You're listening to Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast, episode number 55, with licensed clinical social worker Alison Ly, where she discusses the challenges faced by first and second generation adult children of immigrants. Today, she introduces her trademarked concept of the repay cycle, a framework that explores the dynamics of caregiving and self-sacrifice within these families. Allison also emphasizes the importance of self-compassion and how you can learn to hold space for your grief and emotions. Let's start today's episode. The majority of the listeners are Asian American, Pacific Islanders, second gen, and a lot of them have never been told about what boundaries are. And so can you break down what that is for us?
Yeah. So boundaries is anything that we feel that could protect us, right? In any way. It could be emotions, it could be time, it could be energy, finances, anything that we want to protect or preserve. Like resting, you could create a boundary around resting, and it's not like you may not feel relief necessarily always after a rest attempt, but that's still a way that we could set boundaries. And I think boundaries could be told to other people. Like I could tell someone, hey, I can't meet you at this certain time because I have this other commitment, or it could be something that I internally tell myself. And I think for my clients, there's this misconception that if I tell someone a boundary and they don't meet it or they don't agree with it, like I can't set boundaries, when actually we could set our own boundaries and no one really needs to know about it if we don't feel safe to do it, or we don't feel that they could respect it or understand it, or whatever it is that's stopping us from telling other people. So I think boundaries is just a really important thing that we have to think about in protecting our energy, emotions, and it's a little bit of like letting other people know what we need, whether directly telling them or indirectly telling them.
Letting people know what we need, whether it's direct or indirectly telling them. You know, I heard a mentor say to me once that sometimes we teach people the things that we most need to learn ourselves. Are boundaries something that you've struggled with before?
To be fair, I still struggle with it. I don't think boundaries is something that you master and then you never struggle with again, just kind of like with anything else in life, because new situations come up and new things challenge us. And I think boundaries is something that you don't really know you need sometimes until it's crossed, right? Like if I worked a 60-hour week and I was like, oh, this used to be okay before, which I would not recommend to anyone.
So relatable.
And then suddenly I'm like, oh, I can't do this anymore, right? Then I realize my boundaries need to shift. So I think it's an ongoing thing that we'll always have to like think about and readjust for ourselves. And yes, I personally have had struggled with boundaries, and I still do sometimes, right? I think it's always something I'm improving on. And the reason I am so passionate about it and like want to even expand out of my therapy practice to reach more people and in my coaching practice is that I think this information and setting boundaries could be helpful for anyone. And once we know the tools, we're more able to apply it to a situation and shorten the duration of our like negative emotions or stress or feeling like we're stuck. And then we can move forward quicker. And, you know, for me, I've had to struggle with that personally, and I walked my clients through that, and especially around families, because I'm also a second gen, and my mom, my parents, my family kind of had a hard time knowing what boundaries are as well. So I felt like I had to convince myself that it was okay, kind of like what we had talked about earlier, that it's okay to set boundaries, and it's not disrespectful. It doesn't mean that I don't care about people. It doesn't mean that I'm selfish. And I can still set boundaries and not be those things.
Two things you said. One, I don't realize I need to set new boundaries until they're crossed. And the second thing is you mentioned boundaries with work. And I think that that's definitely a threshold we didn't discuss in our last podcast episode. Because when you came on, you had just started your own practice. And you were talking about boundaries in the context of relationships, but can you say more about new boundaries that are crossed with our jobs? Like, tell me more about your personal experience and how you knew that boundary was crossed.
I think it's hard to know, and especially being an entrepreneur, like I set my own schedule.
Yeah.
So when I work, no, like I'm my boss, right? So I think actually I've heard this a lot with entrepreneurs is that they're their own worst boss because they think they can do it all. And so I think there were moments where I've actually been in other coaching programs where the coach would say, I think you need a break. And I was like, no, I don't need a break. Like, what are you talking about? But actually like hearing them say it and I was like, no, I actually do need a break. So sometimes it really just takes having another person really like call you out on it. And also then once I realized like, oh, how did they know that I needed it? I'm like, oh, I knew these signs too. I just didn't want to admit it. Right. So I think it's also being able to check in with ourselves, listen to other people's feedback without taking it too critically, and then adapting. So it's a trial and error. And I think incorporating things that I want to do that are fun for me more is something I have to like intentionally do because I also love my work. So I can easily like sit for hours and like just be okay with it and not realize that like, oh, I actually really needed a break. So I just have to plan more walks, self-care activities, listening to music instead of podcasts all the time to like give myself a break.
I kind of want to slow us down a little bit because you said a lot of really valuable information in that short amount of time. What you said earlier was, I used to be able to work a 60-hour work week and now I can't. And so break down the process for me about how you accepted that statement, because historically, I think I can only speak from my experience. Like there have been times where I used to be able to work from 8 to 8, sometimes 8 to 10, and my body could take it. And now I'm at a place where I'm so sensitive to that I know that I can't do that anymore. And so I'd love to hear some of the signs of how you know that a boundary has been crossed and like how you engage in self-compassion with that.
I think first of all, like now I have like a child also. So she's 2 and she constantly wants my attention, which is great. I love it. And also I know, and sometimes I'm like, I want to do work, right? So then I have to really check in and be like, what do I actually want to be doing right now? And like, you know, adjust it accordingly or set actual times away from her to do the work. So then I find that because I'm intentionally setting time away from my family, I also want to be very mindful of how productive I am and all of that. So I think also there was a period of time where I tried to be overproductive and stress myself out during those times, as opposed to just whatever I get done during those like 2 hours, 3 hours is what I get done. There was a lot of pressure I put on myself during those hours, even though I set the boundary of a time. So I think it's just even checking in emotionally of like, how am I feeling? Where do I feel it in my body? Because it's easy to just hold it all in and not like take a walk to release some of that, because I'm like, oh, I set 2 hours. I need to do it now. So there's a time component, emotional component, and also just like a check-in that needs to be done even within our boundaries that I've had to really try to do.
There's a time component, an emotional component, and even being able to renegotiate the boundaries I've already set with my boundaries.
Yeah, that's why it's constantly
it's constantly changing and evolving, but it's refreshing to hear you say that, because I don't think this is something that we talk about in our modern society, where just because you set a boundary doesn't mean that that boundary is being kept. And so tell me about how you want to show up now as a mom and what you do to hold yourself accountable with the type of energy level you want for yourself. Because I think boundaries keep us sane, right? My understanding, based on what you're telling me, it's being able to treat yourself with the dignity that you deserve in your relationships and your personal life. So how do you make sure that you show up for your daughter, show up for yourself, and not have resentment for your work?
It's been a trial and error as well. So sometimes if I find myself feeling too stressed and trying to multitask, then that is when I have to pick, right? And then also like kind of let go and know what is the top priority right now. And again, right, then going back to the boundary setting, looking at my week, my month, what can I push back? What is most urgent? Can I move it to another day to make sure that I do get the top priority things done, but not worry so much about everything else? So it's like really cutting out the noise. And then if I'm feeling like super stressed, like with my daughter or like with my work, it's like kind of trying to identify what it is. Is it like the fact that right now she is very like clingy and wants to play all the time, and that's not like, I just don't want to do that, and that's fine too. It doesn't mean anything about me as a mom. Or is it because I'm thinking about this other thing and I think she's bothering me, right? Like trying to like really be super specific about what the thing is that's bothering me, so then I can readjust. Not sure if that answered your question, but that's kind of like just teasing out the actual root cause of the negative emotion so that we know where to readjust our boundaries.
Yeah, I think you answered my question perfectly. So let's kind of stay there for a second and zoom in on your planning, because I'm noticing that planning and knowing what first things are first are really important for you. So systemically, are you somebody that zooms out on their month and then plans from there? Or do you think about what's important to you during a season and plan from that place? I guess I'm curious as to, like, for people who are listening to this who might be struggling with work-related boundaries, how do you structure your day so that you can have space as a mom, as a therapist, and as an entrepreneur, and as a wife, for that matter?
Yeah. I actually hadn't done a very good job of zooming out. I think I'm very like in the moment planning, and I've had to work really hard to zoom out more. And that actually helps me prioritize better.
Okay.
Because I've actually bought this like big desktop calendar. I put it on my wall, and I'm like, okay, these are the things that needs to be done by specific dates. So then it actually eases my mind in zooming out. Because usually I'm just like, today I need to do this, today I need to, I didn't do it. Like, oh shoot, like why didn't I do it? And then I get kind of stressed, right? But if I zoom out and it's like, well, it's not even necessary yet, then it brings me peace of mind, and then it draws a much firmer boundary on when it actually needs to get done. So I think for me personally, zooming out is so necessary, and I've had to like purposefully like make ways to zoom out even more. And then I have my little to-do list, of course, and I have to limit that, because otherwise I'm not zooming. I'm zooming out too much for the day. So there's this balance of trying to do zoom out, but not zoom out too much. Yeah, it's a whole like strategy.
Tell me what you mean by that. Zoom out too much. How can you zoom out too much?
So if I know like already like next month what I want to do, and I make my to-do list and I start adding on things that like maybe will be due in a couple of days, or something I want to get done in a week, right, and I add it to my to-do list today, then I'm zooming out too much for what I'm doing today, and I'm adding unnecessary pressure into what I want to accomplish this day, and then I feel bad for not doing all the things I wanted to do.
So what I'm hearing you say is, when you set too many goals for yourself, it can create stress in your body. And you don't want to do that. You want to set realistic, simple goals. So I think as an entrepreneur and as a therapist, we naturally have this inclination to help everyone. And so how do you identify what is your priority? Like, what's the filter that it has to go through?
So this is actually something I talk to my clients a lot about. It's like filtering through if it's like health related, if it's urgent, right? Kind of going through like the crisis things that you would deal with first. If this is like, if I don't do this, then someone's going to be hurt, or like physically hurt, maybe not emotionally, but that also is considered. And kind of run through like what must happen by end of day. And if this doesn't happen, does it stop anything else from happening that's urgent? And that's usually my first go-to question.
Yeah. Do you help your clients define for themselves what urgency is? Or do you tell them like urgency means that it's a health-related emergency, an emergency, or it needs to get done today? Like, how do you navigate that with a client?
Yeah, usually I ask my clients and they kind of naturally get to that themselves, and maybe it's not the first run, but eventually they get to that point. Because I think just the definition of urgent, like people kind of like urgent care, right? You think of like it has to be like super immediate. They naturally get there, but you have to give them a little bit of time generally. And that's the same for me, because sometimes I'm like, well, no, I need to put away this pile of clothes, but I'm like, do I? Maybe not.
That's the thing about being an entrepreneur. I think this is going to apply to so many people that have power over their own schedules, because remote work has brought about so many easy distractions and so many priorities. I say that in quotation marks for people that are listening over audio. Like, how do you navigate all of those things? Because it sounds like, you know, when you're an entrepreneur, you're now having to dictate your own schedule. You have your own business. It feels like everything is important. And so in the years that you've been doing this now, what have you done to make sure that you've had focus?
That's a good question. With the focus, I think I have to, kind of going back to what you mentioned earlier about having different seasons. Like right now, I'm in the building up stage of my coaching business. So I know that this season's going to be tougher, and realizing that that's okay and it doesn't have to be this way all the time, but also intentionally adding in like time to do other things outside of that. Because I think for a little while, I had a hard time. Like, I just wanted to get it done. Like, I wanted to get it done fast, but it's not going to happen that as quickly as I would like, regardless of how much effort I put in. So it's also not worth it to me to like sacrifice my own needs, right? And I think a lot of times, it's easy for me to put aside my needs versus like household stuff or other stuff or family stuff. And I think it's recognizing that if I am not taken care of, like all the other things won't be done at all. So as much as I want to put in more energy into like completing a project or whatever it may be, like I need to take care of myself. And this is the same for relationships, honestly, right? If we don't take care of ourselves, we can't continue to help our parents, help our family, because then we're burnt out and then we just like, don't want to talk to them. So it's the same idea, but like it applies differently and sometimes more harshly.
I'm of the belief that we're all connected. Not that we're all connected, but that everything is connected. The way that we do one thing is the way that we do everything. And I relate to you a lot when you talk about work and wanting to just like be there for people, because when you talked about the repay cycle in your previous episode, you did talk about wanting to be a good daughter and wanting to be there for everyone. And I think I told you this story, but when I was, I think 25, I'm not 25 anymore, obviously, because I'm telling this in past tense, but I would work from 8 to 8. And I also had a side hustle I was doing. So I was working like 12 hours every day for the last 3 months. And it wasn't until I sat down with my therapist and talked through my pattern that I realized that I had a proclivity to work as a way to mask a lot of my feelings of inadequacy. And I think that sometimes with boundaries, it might be hard to maintain boundaries in my experience because of how I'm perceiving myself. And so I'm curious about like what reflective questions would you encourage people listening to this to ask if they struggle with even keeping boundaries?
Yeah, and I think the story that you shared is so great, because I think a lot of second gens and people with a history of migration in their family really struggle with that, because there could be this also desire to just prove or to like achieve, and it's hard. I think if, for example, if feelings weren't talked about a lot in the family too, like we just learn to like do things to cover it up or to push it away. And sometimes work can be one of those things, right? Where it's just like, well, at least I'm productive in this thing. And not to say that it was for you, but I think that could be a pattern.
No, you're correct.
So So I think questions that people can ask is like, am I doing this because like, going back to urgency, is this urgent? Is this necessary? Or do I feel like I want to do this so that I can feel productive, so I don't have to have like potential negative thoughts about myself for not achieving, or so I don't have to sit with this uncomfortable feeling, or it's just the better thing to worry about compared to something else because it's easier, it's comfortable. It's kind of like a math problem where you can do a math problem and you get an answer, right? But then if you read an English problem, what are they called even? Questions? And you're like, there could be 10 different ways to answer this, and that's harder to do than answering the math problem.
Yeah, it's like it's interesting the way that humans think because it's easier for us to focus on something else or a different problem. Like it's also one of the reasons why so many people get into addiction, because sometimes the weight of the trauma is so burdensome that people find themselves falling into addictive patterns because they don't want to face the emotion. And I'm curious about, like, for you in your personal life and even in your professional life, like, how have you grappled with those dark thoughts?
Yeah, I think oftentimes the darker thoughts and sadness kind of comes around like grief. And I think a lot of my clients have that too. It's just the nature of being, having parents born in a different country who may not understand the things that you're going through, or being able to relate to some of the challenges and things you're going through, right? Like there's just this big discrepancy that even if you tried, and sometimes people can't even explain it verbally to their parents or their family, it causes a lot of grief. And then it could lead to more thoughts about like, well, is it me? Which is easy, I think, for a lot of my clients to do, where they blame themselves. And then that can lead to like overcompensation, self-sacrificing, overdoing to try to prove that they are good enough when they are good enough already. And that can be a hard one to sit with.
Yeah. I've had clients ask me this question of, isn't grief just when someone dies? Like, how do you mean that grief is affecting the way that I'm working or the way that I'm living my life? Can you answer that question for us?
Yeah, grief definitely could be when someone, passes, when someone dies, and it could be just a change, right? Or a expectation that we had that isn't quite met. It doesn't have to be just a physical loss. It could be emotionally, and it could be something that we just like were really hoping for, right? Like a dream, a goal. Like if someone really wanted to live in Australia and never got to, they could be sad about that because they had to do these other things in the States, right? Like that could be grief too. But of course they're different, and it's not like to compare any grief, right? But there are different kinds of grief that it's just when we're wanting something and it's not there, or we can't have it.
So grief doesn't always mean that you had it. It can also be a longing of something that you would want, like especially when it comes to your parents and what that relationship is like, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. When you go to the root of the issue, I'm hearing you say, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that usually it has to do with your childhood patterns and what you believed gave you worth. How do you, like, let's say someone's listening to this and they're realizing like, oh, I don't have the best relationship with my parents because they're from another country. They would never understand the weight of my feelings and emotions. Where can someone start healing?
Yeah. I think if they're ready for it, it's really sitting with their own needs first and not judging it. I think the judgment is easy to seep in. So first of all, like trying to make space for that when grief is really uncomfortable, and, talking about things that we want could be uncomfortable because they've already suppressed it for so long. So making space for that is like the first, probably hardest step. But then also if they're able to not judge themselves for wanting whatever it is that they're wanting, because they want it for a reason, and it doesn't mean that it's right or wrong or it's bad or good. It's just, that's just what we wanted. And, how can we just create some space for it?
You said a very interesting nuance that I want to double click on. You said, if someone is ready for healing, start with asking yourself what you need. How do you know as a person, even as a therapist, that someone isn't ready to do the healing?
Yeah, I love that. And that double click visual was very good too.
Thank you.
I think if It's hard because it's hard for everyone, and it's obviously not a one size fit all. But I think if they're thinking about it for a long time and they're really wanting to create more positive relationships or interactions, knowing that they can't really change other people, or maybe they've tried so much to like change or help other people see what they've seen and it's just not working, could be a sign where, gosh, I've tried for like 10 years. This hasn't worked. Like, do I want to do something different? Could be like a clue. And just really like not rushing into it either, because I think it's not going to be a quick fix, because of course, if something's been in your childhood and your family for a long time, things don't change overnight necessarily. So I think just kind of like being mindful of that as well.
Yeah. So if someone is trying really hard to change the other person in the relationship, whether you're the child of someone who's an immigrant or whether you're an immigrant that's trying to change their children, that person might not be ready to do the healing work because they're trying to change everyone except themselves.
And I think sometimes people need to kind of go through all the options they have, right? Like, I need to try this, I need to try this before they're ready to be like, okay, like, well, these things aren't working. What else can I do?
That's a hard one. I think as a therapist, I know exactly what you're saying, because sometimes clients lie to themselves and don't admit that, you know, I'm the common denominator. Maybe there's something I can do. How do you sit with someone who might not be ready, but says they're ready?
I think is just continuing to reiterate that readiness, because maybe they think they are right. Like you're saying, they may not be fully ready, but they think they are. And I think that's still a huge step, because we can't even begin to think we want to run a marathon without being aware of a marathon, right? So I think it's still really important to just validate that. And even if they're still trying and doing things that aren't getting the outcomes that they want, it's just allowing it and not really judging it and not trying to stop them necessarily either, but just kind of pointing out like, well, again, going back to like, how does this make you feel? And do you want to keep doing this thing? Right? Because then it's just more about their own energy level, their own desires, their own motivation to continue to try that thing.
Yeah. I'm smiling right now because it reminds me of who I was as a 19-year-old kid entering therapy for the first time. I'm only realizing in hindsight how much patience my therapist had for me at that time, because when I came into therapy, all I did was blame everyone else for how I turned out. And in some ways, I have compassion for that part of me, because it was this person's fault and this person's fault. Yes and no, because it takes two to tango. And it took probably 3 years of consistent therapy for me to realize like, oh, what can I do to change? And, you know, I just want to tell the listener who might be listening to this and is still struggling with a lot of resentment that it's okay. Like, everything is on a journey. But for those that are ready, like, one of the hardest questions in my experience with therapy is actually asking myself what I needed. And so, like, let's kind of talk about that. Typically, what are some needs that people fail to provide for themselves when you're on the other side of the chair, Allison?
I think the first thing that pops up into my head is just like, again, this is why I wanted to create the course stuff, is saying no, right? Like, how can they say no and just give themselves space? And it doesn't mean no permanently either. It could just be like, not right now, or give me 10 minutes, give me a little bit of time to kind of think about it or sort through this. I think they don't, sometimes there's this like sense of urgency that may not be realistic, because the other party might be feeling urgent too, right? Like, being second gen, you know, there were times where paperwork had to be done. And, you know, of course, if someone can't read a paperwork, they're going to feel worried about it. So then that worry, I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to do this real quick right now. When it's like, well, do I? Right? That questioning, that pausing wasn't available because I might be sensing other people's urgency and wanting to help them too. So then there feels like there is no space to say no. So I think knowing that no, right, isn't permanent and we don't have to do it forever, but it's available to sometimes just create that pause is really, really beneficial so that we can actually even think, do we need anything right now? Because if our answer is always yes, yes, yes right away, we don't even have that moment to think like, oh, do I need to use the bathroom first? Do I need water? Do I need to do something else prior to doing this thing that I'm helping someone else with, or, you know, something that is being asked of me?
I loved how your needs examples were so simple and easy. Like, do I need water? Do I need to use the bathroom? I had a professor tell me once, because I was holding my pee during like a really important like conference. He looked at me and he went, you know, Helen, sometimes self-care is being able to use the bathroom when you need to use the bathroom. And that was really mind-blowing for me. Because I think as like people of color, we're so loyal to our family. And it's easy to like forget yourself. What do you say to people who criticize the entire self-care movement? Like, why is self-care so important?
To the first part, right, of it being criticized, I think it's falling into this like all or nothing. You do all this self-care or you don't do it at all. You need to go on vacation. You need to not talk to anyone for like a month to have self-care. But again, it's like, how do we incorporate that in your daily life so that you don't need that massive, like, I don't know, space from people. So I think that's my perspective of why it's being criticized, because it seems like all or nothing, where it's like you're being selfish, you're not talking to anyone at all, when it doesn't have to be that way.
Talk to me about why self-care is really important. That was my question.
I think, yeah. So it kind of goes back to what I said earlier of like, if we aren't taken care of, we can't take care of other people, right? If we continue to sacrifice our needs and we burn out, the people that we care the most about, the jobs, the goals that we have that are so near and dear to us, won't even have space to grow, right? Like that relationship won't grow, our careers can't grow because we're not taking care of ourselves to be able to continually nourish that, right? And I think it's more about sustainability when we are taking care of ourselves versus like I don't know, thinking of it as like, I'm not going to do this thing forever or something, right? Like the all or nothing kind of thinking again. So it's just like thinking again of the bigger picture and zooming out and knowing that this is beneficial in the long run, right? Like if you don't take those sips of water and while you're running a marathon, it may not be beneficial towards meeting the goal of getting to the end of the marathon.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of like, if you really think of your boundaries like an investment in yourself, like you might not see that money and the return it has over time, but if you see it as being able to put little by little, I'm investing in myself, long term, you don't have to spend as much saving. Yes, because you've already invested in that really ideal future, which I think is really beautiful. So before we go on, you mentioned your course. Tell us about your course. Why is it important to you? Tell me more, because you talked about saying no. I'm interested.
Yeah. So my course is all about setting boundaries and strengthening your relationships, because I think without boundaries, it's hard to have a stronger relationship with people that we are wanting to have relationships with, especially family members and parents who may not know what boundaries are. And that's, I love boundaries, and I really wanted this course to be available to more people than just in my practice. That's why I created this separate business, you know, and it's not like going to fix everything. Obviously, with everything that we've talked about, everything is like a marathon. It takes time, it takes nurturing and really sustained effort. But I think if people are ready and want tools, that could be an easy way to kind of get some of that up front and then learning how to apply it. So that's why I created it, because I just want to be able to reach more people. And I found that these things that I've talked about with my clients have been super helpful. So I just want to reach more and see who can benefit from it. Because like I've also personally, like we've talked about, struggled with boundaries too. And I think if I had known some of these tools and these things ahead of time, it could have helped, just quicken the process a little bit.
Mm. I want to be respectful of time because I know we don't have much, but one of the biggest pieces of feedback I get from clients with the populations we serve, Asian Americans, is they feel really guilty when they allow someone to cross their boundaries. Like there's very much so like this self-hatred mindset of like, man, I did something wrong. Now here's yet another relationship where I've allowed someone to cross my boundaries. What advice would you give them and how to reframe that thinking?
Yeah, I think we talked about this earlier too, right? Sometimes it takes someone crossing our boundary to know that we actually need it. And maybe it's just like having extra data, right? We needed more experiences where it kept getting crossed, that we knew that this was a firm enough boundary that we want to reestablish and want to like tend to more, so that this doesn't happen again with maybe this person or someone else in the near future. So I think it's actually a good thing. Like you're getting more information.
Yeah. How do you have that conversation with other people?
I think you'd have to tell me. I don't know how to say this off the cuff.
Sure. So, like, let's say that somebody wants so much of your time, or you're really busy, but you have like a friend that calls every single day last minute to make plans. Like, how would you have a conversation with a friend about setting a boundary?
Well, I'll just kind of imagine some scenarios, right? So I would say something like, if this is a reoccurring time that actually isn't good for me, let's say, I noticed this pattern's happened a couple times already, and I would say that, hey, like, generally 5 o'clock is not a good time for me to answer the phone. Like, is there another time that you're available? And I would offer other times that I'm available too for them to call, right? Or, hey, I may not answer you when you call at this time because I've noticed I'm not free, but I could always call you back, or I'll shoot you a text when I'm ready. And I just want to give you a heads up because I don't want you to think I'm ignoring you, right? Which is where the guilt, you could alleviate some of the guilt by actually letting them know ahead of time versus just continually answering and either being annoyed or feeling like bad or feeling like mean for responding to them in a certain way.
That's a really good point. Communication is something else that I notice a lot of clients struggle with. Of they know their boundary after someone's crossed it, but they never make it explicit. And so based on your experience, I guess, Allison, when is a good time to have a conversation with someone, or how do you know someone is open to having a boundary setting conversation? Or do you just say it for your own safety?
Yeah, it depends on their, like in that example, my own personal preference, right? If I don't feel comfortable telling them, so going back to what we talked about with indirect boundaries, I could just not answer. I could just not answer, and I could shoot them a text, say, hey, got your message. We'll call you back later. I don't need to tell them, hey, this is not a good time for me, like in that detail. Or, I could just call them ahead of time if I knew that they were going to call me, right? And then not feel bad about it. So there are things that you could do on your own if you're not even sure if the other party will hear it well. But some clues to, if that person is actually ready to hear your boundary is actually kind of tough to predict unless you know them well and you've set boundaries with them before. So I think we can always prepare that they won't take it well and then choose to not take it personally.
Yeah.
But it's hard.
The only way to know if someone is a good person who takes boundaries well is to test the relationship by having those types of conversations. And for people like me, and like you too, Allison, who've grown up as like second gen, I'm 1.5, like it's really, we're never taught these. And so we're much more receptive to allowing people to treat us however they treat us. And, it takes a lot of practice, which before we end in just a couple of minutes, can you tell me more about indirect boundaries? Because in the United States, for context, direct communication is really encouraged. But as you stated, there are times when indirect boundaries are just more appropriate in the situation. And so can you say more about that?
Yeah. And I think this is going back to like knowing what your needs are. So we'd have to know that first. So I don't have to tell someone if I don't want to answer calls after 2 p.m. if I wanted to, right? Like, if that's a boundary that I want, I could just tell myself, do not disturb after 2 p.m. And whoever calls me, if I see it, I can see if I want to call back. So like, that's an example of not letting other people know. And then just deciding for me that, after 2 p.m., 5 p.m., it's not a good time for me to talk to people, and not having to text everybody I know and be like, hey, don't call me. Right. And that could be one way. And I think it just really comes back to like checking in with our needs and knowing why we're doing it. Right. I think that is really important, because if we just say it kind of willy-nilly, the guilt is going to kick in, and the questioning and the, oh, I'm a bad person might kick in, versus like, no, like after 5 p.m., I just want to eat dinner and watch TV. Right? Maybe I'll turn my phone back on at 8 or whatever it may be.
Yeah. Do you have practices of reflection to help you figure out what boundaries are appropriate? Like, do you have daily rituals for reflecting on that?
I think about it actually if there's an intense emotion, like if there's a lot of anger usually, or sadness around something, I do journal about it. I kind of talk about it too with either my therapist, a friend, or whoever else that feels relevant, that might understand that situation. So that's also a boundary, right? I don't share everything with everyone because I don't know how they're going to respond.
Yeah.
So that is one way. And then journaling about it, and just really like trying to practice that self-compassion of like, why did I feel that way versus I shouldn't have felt that way.
That's such a great way to define self-compassion, where I do feel this way versus I shouldn't feel this way. It's just if you want to boil it down, it's being honest and kind to yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Allison, thank you so much for being on the show again. And thank you for your willingness to really give us your time, because, I've heard back from some past podcast guests who've listened to part 1 and 2 of our original Boundaries episode, where you talked about your cultural upbringing, being a second gen, and that got the most plays from our last podcast season last week. Since I checked, it's the most listened to podcast we've published so far. So you being able to talk about work-related boundaries, identifying your own needs, being able to promote your course with setting boundaries is so needed for the world. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Helen. I know it's been a challenge getting on too, so thank you.
No, thank you. I appreciate you. If you enjoy mental health education like this, please don't forget to subscribe. The quality of these episodes do get better with more subscribership, and it helps spread the word of our message, helping Asian Americans better their own mental health treatment and possibly get access to mental health treatment. And so I'll see you next Friday, and thank you for subscribing and liking the show.